So, what happens when a climate scientist takes the data they stare at all day and actually radically applies it to their own life? Well, that's the whole question at the heart of Peter Kalmus's book, Being the Change. Today, we're going to dive into his personal journey from a pretty standard high carbon lifestyle to something completely different. It's a fascinating look at how one person responded to a global crisis by, well, starting with himself. Kalmus kicks things off with this really provocative idea. He's basically arguing that the climate crisis isn't just about CO2 or policy failures. No, at its very core, it's a failure of our ability to imagine a different way of living, a different story. And that idea, right there, is the foundation for his entire experiment. So, the man behind all this is Peter Kalmus, a climate scientist. For years, his job was all about the numbers, the models, the really stark predictions of a warming planet. But then he started to feel this deep, unsettling disconnect between what he knew at work and how he was living at home. And this was the disconnect. I mean, on one hand, all the science was screaming that Earth's life support systems were in serious trouble. But on the other hand, his own life looked pretty normal for an American professional. He was flying, driving everywhere, and personally adding about 20 tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. That contradiction just became too big for him to ignore. So he didn't just decide to, recycle a little more. Kalmus set this incredibly audacious goal to cut his own fossil fuel use by a whopping 90%. That means getting down to just 1/10 of his previous impact. This wasn't about small tweaks. This was about a complete transformation of his life. He saw his approach as this interwoven three-part path. It wasn't just about the data and it wasn't just about the actions. He saw it as a blend of the head, the hands, and the heart. The science gave him the why, the practical actions were the how, and a deeper kind of spiritual examination, well, that was the fuel he needed to actually sustain such a massive change. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How in the world do you actually remake your daily life to cut out 90% of your fossil fuel use? His philosophy wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't all or nothing. He knew that doing nothing was one extreme, but trying to quit fossil fuels cold turkey was another, probably unsustainable one. So instead, he looked for a deliberate, gradual middle path of systematic change. And what did that path actually look like day to day? Well, it included some huge decisions, like giving up flying completely. But it was also about weaving new habits into his life. He started biking as his main way to get around. He dug up his lawn to grow food, and he even got into beekeeping. But the real common thread through all of it was just a radical, across-the-board reduction in his consumption. He discovered these changes weren't just about cutting back. They were about swapping up. He replaced the stress and pollution of sitting in a car with the simple, direct joy of riding a bike. It didn't feel like a sacrifice, but more like a trade-up to a more connected, more physical way of being in the world. And getting his hands in the dirt by growing his own food, that was a game changer. His connection to the natural world just deepened immensely. He argues it's such a fundamental skill that it should be taught in schools right alongside reading and writing. For him, it was a way to step outside the industrial food system and reconnect with where his nourishment really comes from. And this leads us to what might be the most surprising part of his whole story. This journey wasn't some grim, joyless sacrifice. It actually sparked a massive inner revolution, and he unexpectedly found way more happiness and well-being. I know what you're probably thinking. Giving up flying, driving less, consuming way less. It just sounds like a life of deprivation, right? It's the standard assumption that a low-carbon life has got to be a lesser life. But Kalmus found the absolute opposite to be true. He uses words like satisfying and empowering to describe it. Instead of feeling deprived, he felt more alive, more aligned with his own values. And that gave his actions this incredible sense of purpose. So how did he manage this huge internal shift? Well, he picked up a new tool: meditation. He came to see our consumer culture as this thing that's constantly fueled by a manufactured desire for more. Meditation was his way of just stepping off that treadmill, quieting that endless wanting, and finding real contentment in the present moment. And this is really the core discovery of his whole journey. Slashing his fossil fuel use didn't shrink his life, it actually expanded it. By stepping away from that high-carbon consumerist world, he found a life that was so much richer in connection and happiness and in meaning. It turns out, he says, that life on 1/10 of fossil fuels is actually pretty awesome. But Kalmus is really clear. This isn't just about one person's happy, low-carbon life. He argues that this kind of personal transformation is a vital first step toward much, much bigger systemic change. So, individual action matters in a global crisis because it creates a new story. By living differently, you show other people that another way is even possible. You directly challenge that old story that says we have to consume endlessly to be happy. Each personal action becomes this living, breathing example of a different future. And that brings us to the new story he thinks we need to tell on a massive scale. He contrasts our current exponential growth economy with what he calls a steady state economy. This comparison is basically his blueprint for the kind of systemic shift we need, moving away from a system that demands infinite growth on a very finite planet. Let's just zero in on the most fundamental difference here, because it's huge. Our current system basically treats the entire biosphere, the planet's life support system, as just one more resource to be fed into the economy. A steady state model completely flips that script. It recognizes that the economy is a part of the biosphere, and it can't possibly thrive if it destroys its own foundation. This thought just totally reframes what it means to be an activist. That pressure to save the world, it can be paralyzing. Kalmus found peace when he let go of that burden. Instead, he just focuses on what he can control, living a good life, a life that's aligned with his values. And in doing that, he believes he actually can change the world. So, as we wrap up this look into one scientist's pretty incredible journey, the final question really turns back to us. Kalmus argues that we're all living out a story, whether we know it or not. The whole point of being the change is about consciously choosing a new one. And it kind of leaves us all to wonder, what new story will you choose to live?